So, to start out this chapter on sex and gender and race, we need to start by talking about some definitions. So, we'll start with sex and gender, and really, it wasn't until the 60s that people started to talk about gender and sex separately. And to talk about sex first, usually we think, if we were pushed on the question, which we probably don't normally think about, is that we would define sex perhaps by using chromosomes and say, well, okay, if you have XX, you're female, if you have XY, you're male. But there are different configurations that exist in nature that aren't XY or XX. And so these can result in different kind of intersex people. So it doesn't turn out to be that easy to simply define sex that way. So some people like Alison Stone have said, well, okay, let's use something like a cluster theory, and that is that certain biological characteristics appear together because they affect one another and they're sort of related in particular ways. So if one person has enough of these relevant properties that are normally associated, say, with the XX chromosome, and certain genitalia hormones and secondary sex characteristics, then we can say, okay, they're a male or female. So they might be missing some of them, or some of them might be different, but if you have enough of these cluster characteristics together, then you can call somebody one sex or another. And Stone in particular is still very attached to this idea of a bifurcation of sex, that there are male and female. And she allows that there might be a spectrum to where, yeah, there's these variations, but she still wants to say that even within the spectrum, we can still bifurcate. We can still say that everybody has to choose a side or have one chosen for them based on this, maybe this cluster theory. But a lot of us nowadays don't want to perhaps do this, or want to say, well, biology does not just determine sex, so we might favor the category of gender instead. And gender being less biologically focused, and perhaps focused more on society and individual choice. So there is this idea of gender essentialism that says, well, okay, there is something that all people share that makes them, say, a woman, or say makes them a man. So all women might share some kind of essential property, and that could be sex related. As we talked about, they might all share the XX chromosome, but that turns out to not work very well. So you might turn it over to gender and say, well, okay, there is something that all women share in the idea of gender essentialism. And this could be open again to the question of that it could be biological, or maybe it's something else. And so a lot of people have taken up this question in various ways. Simone de Beauvoir, though, says, look, that women don't really share a lot in common in a cultural sense. But what she wants to do is say more that they don't. She doesn't want to say that gender doesn't exist. But what she wants to say is that they don't have a shared history or traditions in the same way that people, say, of the Jewish faith might, perhaps, or something like that. So some feminists, though, like Janice Raymond, say, look, transgender individuals are not true women. She talks mostly about the female side, because they don't really understand the historical oppression, and that is a necessary condition for being a woman, is to really share in this oppression that women have had. And she says, look, this whole transgender idea is just that people are not satisfied with their race and gender roles, and not that they want to actually become the other sex. And this is not a very super popular view, but it's out there. And so again, some people have rejected the idea of gender essentialism, saying that, look, there's nothing that every woman shares that makes them a woman, whether it's something biological or whether it's something social or something else. And part of the reason why they want to reject this is because, especially if it's biology that is this gender essentialist piece, then if biology can't be changed, then, and biology determines women's place in social hierarchy, and then there's no reason to try to change that, because if it's determined by biology and biology can't be changed, then we can't change the social hierarchy. And that's why a lot of feminists want to reject gender essentialism. And the same issue comes up with sexuality. So someone's sexual feelings and desires might be biologically determined, and a lot of people do think that, but that ends up causing some problems as well. Again, feminists have fought against this biological determinism and the thought that, well, if biology can't be changed and social norms are determined by biology, then we don't want to have this biology being determining our social roles, right? So feminists have sometimes said that they're not different, that women are not different from men, that they don't necessarily share something that makes them all different in this because of this problem. But then also the gay rights movement has taken this essentialism and used it in favor of themselves, because they've said, look, if sexual orientation is not a choice but is rooted in biology, then you can't blame somebody for their sexual orientation. So they've sort of taken that idea of determinism, social determinism or sexuality determinism, and kind of turned it over and used it in their favor. And interestingly, this is kind of the opposite of what a lot of feminists have done. So this is, again, you can use the idea that we can't change our sexual orientation to combat the idea that non-heterosexual people are sexual predators, and that they're going to sort of force heterosexual people to become not heterosexual. If you're going to argue that sexuality is biologically determined, that's not going to make any sense. So that's why a lot of gay rights activists have pushed to this. But as Joanna Quest points out, the science hasn't really held this up very well. So people have been trying to find out, are people's brains different depending on their sexual orientation, and it turns out that they haven't found a connection there. Now, there may be one, but it has not been found. And so that's one reason not to use that. The other reason is that some people want to say, look, we have some choice, we have some agency in our sexual orientation, in our sex or gender roles, and all these things, that people have the right to decide what gender they want to be represented by, what sexual orientation they want to have. And you can't have it both ways. If it's biologically determined, then you're not going to have the choice. So this is a big sort of debate and problem within the gay community and within the feminist movement. So again, we're starting to figure out that this idea that transgender people were born into the wrong bodies, or that there's sort of this strong biological idea, is going to be too simplistic. But again, if you're going to go all the other way to the idea of choice, then it's going to cause some problems for the movement if you're going to be able to say that they could perhaps influence other people to become also gay, then that's something that conservatives and people who are against LGBTQ rights are really pushing people on. So the idea of which way to go with it ends up being difficult. And it's also difficult for the feminists, because if they want to say that, well, being a woman is a choice in a sense, or that gender is fluid in that way, then it's a little more difficult to argue about discrimination or to point to discrimination when it's seen as a choice and not something that you are simply born into. And defining what a woman is also ends up being a lot more difficult too. So this idea of queer theory is that, well, okay, maybe we don't have to really put ourselves into these boxes. And as David Halperin says, it's an identity without an essence, so that it can really use to be referred to almost anyone. And this is part of the criticism of this whole idea, is that if it can refer to anyone, then what's the point of it anyway? What's it even saying? And so that turns out to be a problem. But it's meant to be more inclusive and to sort of move away from this idea of categorizing everybody. And again, like the issue with women and the issue of race, we want to say that if we're not going to have a distinction between LGBTQ plus people and quote straight people, then it's going to be hard to say how their experiences are different. If there is no difference, then how can we talk about oppression? How can we talk about the difficulties, the special difficulties that they have to navigate in the social sphere? But then again, if you're going to say it's a choice or socially constructed, then it can cause a problem for legal cases, but saying that it's rooted in biology also could open it up to discrimination in other ways. So really, it's hard to know which way to go socially, and science has not come up with the answer, at least not yet.